Hi, this is Mike's Unboxing, Reviews and How To, and today we'll be taking a look at the BIOS on the MSI B460M pro-vdh Wi-Fi. Today's date is Monday the 28th of February 2022, so do bear that in mind if there are any changes on your BIOS. This is obviously slightly time sensitive, but generally most of it will remain the same. If there's any comments, questions or problems that you're having, please feel free to reach out to us at mike@mikesunboxing.com, or use the comments section below if there's any questions or anything you need answering or in more detail, and I'll try and answer you as best as I can. So getting straight on with it, this is the MSI Click BIOS version 5. This is the sort of easy mode. This is the first one you're likely to see. So in the top left hand corner we've got things like the time and date, current CPU speed and our DDR speed. Ours is currently set to 2666, which was done by enabling the XMP profile here by clicking on that tab. You've also got other options if you've got a different processor, such as Creator Genie, etc. And also if your RAM supports other XMP profiles, you may find that one of these is also illuminated. Moving across, we've got our temperature section and more detail about the motherboard. So our CPU core temperature, motherboard temperature, current vCore rating, DDR voltage, our BIOS mode, whether it's in CSM or Uefi. If you're using a slightly older hard drive from an older machine, you may wish to enable CSM if your components do not support Uefi. Also, we've got our motherboard model here listed. Also, the CPU type, where you're currently using an i3 10105F. Memory size is listed, BIOS version, and the BIOS build date. Underneath, we've got our boot priority. So this will change if you're in CSM or Uefi mode. So we've got our hard drive listed there. You can choose these by just dragging them around. So if you want to boot from a DVD or CD, slide that along there. If you want to boot from a USB stick, if it's installed, then you can just drag these across, such as a USB hard drive, memory stick, that kind of thing. But generally you're probably going to want to leave it set to your primary boot device being your main hard drive. On the side here, in our easy mode, we've got options for CPU, which tells us our CPU frequency and kind of more of the same things, whether or not you've got virtualization enabled and execute disable bits, all those kinds of things. Down the side, obviously CPU, memory, storage, fan info, help. At the bottom here, we've got M-Flash, which is for flashing the BIOS, favorites, which you can actually add favorites to your list from these various pages. We've got hardware monitor. We'll take a look at that in greater detail when we go into the advanced version of this setup. The features will be exactly the same. This is for fan control, that kind of thing. Speaking of fan control, we've got our CPU fan fail warning. So you can turn this on or off by just clicking and highlighting. When it's grayed out like this, that means it's disabled. When you click on it, it highlights, that means it is enabled. You've also got things like ERP, which is your energy saving protocols. For this particular processor, if you want to get the most out of it on this particular board, because there isn't any real overclocking, then I would suggest leaving ERP off. Obviously, you may need to put that on depending on the country you're in, legislation, restrictions, etc. on energy. ERP will effectively just reduce your power consumption, and also at the same time it may reduce your clock speeds and also some of the performance of your processor. Underneath we've got HD audio controller, so if you want to use the onboard audio, you can have that enabled or disabled. Over here we've got options for the M.2 Optane if you're using an Optane drive. Underneath we've got AHCI or RAID if you're using a RAID setup, then you can turn that on or off, toggle between the two. Whichever one's highlighted in green will be the one which is in use, so we're going to leave it to AHCI as we're just using a standard M.2 drive. And underneath we've got easy LED control, so this basically turns your onboard RGB or addressable RGB on or off. Leaving it like this will disable it, having it like that means it's on. So heading back over to our easy mode, so we've got CPU, we've got memory, so again it tells you details about your memory, the XMP profiles that are supported, and also limitations depending on your processor. So our processor is limited to a maximum speed of 2666, even though our XMP profile can be enabled at DDR4 3000, the memory will only ever run at a maximum of 2666 on this processor. Highest rated speeds on this particular motherboard, due to the restrictions, are 2933 MHz, so no point getting some ultra fast RAM for this particular board. Moving down to storage tells you what drives are actually attached and present. So SATA ports, we've got nothing connected on SATA. We're only using our primary M.2 slot, which is for our Kioxia Xperia SSD, which is listed there with its full size, and our lower M.2 drive is currently unoccupied. Moving down to fan info, so this is essentially a cut down version of what you'll see later on when we go into hardware monitor. So you can choose whether or not your CPU and pump fans are in use, etc. Click on settings and it will go into hardware monitor, the full program or full application. Again, we'll take a look at that in more detail later. This just gives you a brief overview of what is going on, your fan speed, core temperatures, and for your system fan. Now currently we don't have any system fans connected because this is just being set up, so there's nothing to be actually seen in here. There are two headers for CPU and pump, so you've got CPU, which is header 1, P, which would be the pump fan header, and when you go over to system fan you've got two fan headers. One is system fan 1 and one is system fan 2. Underneath we've got the help section, so this just gives you an idea of how to actually navigate around and some of the shortcut keys, such as F4 will take you to CPU specifications, etc, etc. If you want to take a screenshot of any of this, if you've got a USB drive attached, you can click on F12 and you can take a screenshot. Other notable things which are useful is F10, which is save and reset, which you can also do by just clicking on the cross at the top, and it will say do you want to save and reset. So that's pretty much it for the simple mode. So let's click on the top here, advanced, F7, or you can press the F7 key to toggle between the two. So now we are in the advanced mode. So now very similar along the top. All we've got now are these 6 sections here. So let's start on the first one. So we've got settings first of all. So we've got various settings here. So we've got system status. Click on there, it tells you the time, date, what is connected. Very much similar to what we saw before. Press escape and you can go back a level. Next one's going to be advanced. So in advanced we've got our Pcie subsystem timings and settings. So if you're using onboard graphics, that kind of thing, you can enable or disable those features. Pci latency timer, should you wish to change that from 32, 64, 128, etc. Realistically, most of these settings are going to be probably best left as they are. If there's any specific ones which I would recommend changing, I will make sure that you're aware of that as we go through this. So this is the above 4G memory and cryptocurrency mining. So if you're mining, you want to have that enabled. In order to do that, just click on OK and use the arrow keys, or you can use the mouse and choose whichever setting you want. We're not going to be mining, so I'm going to leave that disabled. This section here, max TLUD, or TLUD, set to dynamic. I would leave it as that unless you know exactly what you want it to do. This is for setting essentially a kind of like a buffer for the graphics card, but realistically I would set that as dynamic, otherwise it may eat into the system memory and storage. Resizable bar support, enabled or disabled, you can choose that there. If you've got a graphics card which supports that, then you can enable or disable there. And we've got our IOV support, or SR. So this is for if you're doing some form of virtualization. This will basically allow the system to route through your IO through your virtual machine. Moving down, we've got our PCIe or Pci Aspm settings. Again, unless you really need to change these, I would leave these exactly as they are, but you can set individual settings for pretty much all of the root ports there. Again, leave that well alone unless you know exactly what you're doing or you have a specific need. So going back up, we've got ACPI settings. So we've got options for our power LED to be set to blinking or dual color. This is the CPU over temperature alert, currently is set to disabled. I would suggest leaving that set to auto or enabled to prevent any accidental damage to your processor or components. Power manager, we've got that, you can have that enabled or disabled. I would leave it disabled, and that way you can get the most out of your processor. Power manager, when it's enabled, will reduce the performance somewhat of slightly lower end processors based on the system's ability to keep components cool, that kind of thing. Next one's going to be integrated peripherals. So this is going to be something which you're probably going to want to look at. So VGA detection, you can set to ignore or auto. Again, depending what setup you're using. If you're using a processor with integrated graphics, you may need to enable that to allow you to use onboard graphics and also a separate PCI Express graphics card. Next, we've got our onboard LAN configuration. So we've got the onboard LAN controller. You can have that enabled or disabled. If you want to use the gigabit LAN controller, then you can do. LAN option ROM, so if you want to enable the system to be able to boot from LAN ROM, you can enable that. Network stack, again, this is for the Uefi network settings for the network stack for IPv4, IPv6. Next one is probably the one that most people are going to want to look at. This is the onboard Wi-Fi and Bluetooth control. So you can set that to auto, which is what its default is, or you can set it to Wi-Fi only if you don't want Bluetooth. You can set it to Bluetooth only if you don't want to use Wi-Fi, and you can disable both entirely by choosing Wi-Fi Bluetooth off. We're going to be using Bluetooth and Wi-Fi on this one, so I'm going to set it to auto, which will essentially leave both of them enabled. Next up, we've got our Sata configuration. So again, this is just changing your RAID and Optane modes. If you're just using regular M.2 drives or SSDs, leave this set to AHCI. Next up, you've got Sata Hot Plug. Windows itself doesn't really support hot plugging. This is going to be down to applications and your operating system of choice. Essentially, I would leave all of these as disabled unless you have a specific need or purpose. And the next one at the very bottom is going to be our HD audio controller. If you want to use onboard audio, leave this as enabled. If you're going to be using a separate audio DAC or a sound card, set it to disabled. Obviously, if you're going to be using some kind of setup where you're using the onboard audio and also a separate USB DAC for maybe some kind of streaming purposes or some other audio recording purposes, then you can have that enabled at the same time as having a separate discrete sound card enabled. For best performance, I would select one or the other depending on your needs. Next one is our USB configuration. So this is the XHCI handoff and legacy USB support. If you maybe want to using a particular USB device which is slightly older, I would leave legacy support enabled. And also for sometimes if you're using a slightly older keyboard and mouse and you want to access the BIOS or be able to use the BIOS, you might need to have this enabled. Again, your mileage may vary. Leaving it enabled is probably the best way. Then we've got USB port control. So you've actually got all the USB ports that are listed. If for some reason you want to actually disable any of the USB ports, or in fact all of the USB ports for security purposes, then you can enable or disable them. So maybe if you've got front panel connections and you want those disabled so people can't just plug in a USB drive and take data off your machine, then you can disable the individual ports. Next up is our I/O configuration. So this is basically your serial and parallel ports. You can set those to enabled or disabled. Unless you've got a specific need for them, I would say leave them disabled just to make life easier, and also it's just something else that you don't have to install drivers for, or Windows doesn't have to assign a driver for. Again, you can use that enabled or disabled in both of those options. Power management setup. So this is going to be useful for some of you if you are having issues with possibly a device not charging whilst the system is shut down, or device is not resuming from standby when you click on the mouse or click on the keyboard. If the system's gone into sleep mode, this is where you're going to want to make those changes. So we've got ERP ready, which is the power management, or this actually will reduce the overall performance of the system by reducing power. ERP ready, I would leave disabled unless you have a specific need to. Again, if you have it ERP enabled, even if you've got your USB standby power enabled, you may still have issues, so I would leave that disabled. Restore AC after power loss. So depending on what it is, if you're setting this up as some kind of file server, then you would want to set that to power on or last state. I've got mine set to off, so if there's a power cut, it just stays off until you manually press the power button. System power fault protection, again, entirely up to you. If you've got a particularly bad power supply or an uneven voltage coming through, it might be best to leave that enabled. Here in the UK, we've got pretty decent power, so I've left that as being disabled. USB standby power, so this is the one, if you want your LEDs on your keyboard and mouse and things like that to actually turn off, then you would either enable or disable this to suit. So when you have USB standby power enabled, this will charge devices such as your wireless mouse or wireless headphones, that kind of thing. If they're left on a dock, this will allow them to charge when the PC is physically turned off. If you want to make it so that all your illumination and all the USB ports are off when the PC is off, go in here and choose disabled. Again, down to the individual on that one. Next up is our BIOS CSM or Uefi mode. Again, this is just from what we had on the front screen. So if you've got slightly older components which aren't Uefi compatible, you may wish to use CSM mode. This will also allow you to boot from certain older hard drives that maybe have an older version of Windows on, or depending what kind of file system is actually on the drive, it may or may not be recognized. So you can choose between the two on there. Next up, we've got DTM, which is disabled title message. You can have that enabled or disabled. This will just show certain parts of the BIOS. Some manufacturers will disable this just so it doesn't show boot options, that kind of thing, when the system's first booted up. Entirely up to you, whichever way you do it. Wake up events, so this will be either grayed out or disabled, depending on your S4, S5 settings for standby, etc. So you've got options to wake up event by BIOS or OS. So you can set a timer actually in the BIOS. So if you set it to OS, it will rely on Windows to control the wake up events, either clicking on the keyboard, all that kind of stuff. If you set to BIOS, you can have it by the real-time clock alarm, which you can set. Resume by PCIe device, so maybe if you've got a LAN card on PCIe device and it sets a wake on LAN signal, then you may want to have that enabled. Resume by USB device, pretty much self-explanatory, so that is going to be waking from a signal from a USB device, be it a keyboard, mouse, that kind of thing. And again, we've got the same here. So resume from S3 sleep state, S4 sleep state, or S5 sleep state by a PS2 mouse or a keyboard. You can choose those. Realistically, I'd probably leave those set to OS, let Windows take control of it. Obviously, if you're using Windows, if you're using another operating system, you might want to do that manually. Next one, we've got Secure Erase Plus. So this is to basically erase SSDs, that kind of stuff. And underneath that, we've got an option for NVMe drive, basically a self-test for NVMEs. If you want to test your drive for some reason, you could do that. This will actually reduce life on drives because they're not really designed to be written over and over. So probably best leaving those well alone unless you have a specific need for it. Next up, we've got boot. So we're going to boot. So this gives you some of your boot options. So you've got the full screen logo display. Go to BIOS, which allows you to actually, if you press the power button for more than 4 seconds when the PC is booting up, it will go straight into the BIOS screen, which is sometimes a little bit useful depending on your setup and what you're doing, or if you're struggling to get access to the BIOS, but you'd need to get into the BIOS to change that setting. So boot up numlock state. So if you're using a particular keyboard where the numlock state is actually duplicated on other keys on the keyboard, so maybe a media center, that kind of thing, you can have the numlock set to on or off. Choice is entirely up to you. I'm using a full-size keyboard, so I use it set to on. Info block effect, so this is basically for the graphical setup engine. Yeah, leave this alone unless you know exactly what you want to do. Post bleep, that's pretty much self-explanatory, so when the system boots, or rather posts successfully, there'll be a bleep, that kind of stuff. And MSI Fastboot, so that is basically not detecting some of the devices when the system's trying to boot up, so you can leave that enabled or disabled. It makes a very small difference to actual boot times, but you can if you want to. Fastboot, you've also got the Fastboot feature, so operating systems from Windows 8 onwards will support Fastboot. Generally, I'd recommend probably not having that on. Actually, I'm going to disable that now because I'd rather have a clean boot and for the system to check memory, etc. when I'm booting up. Underneath that, we've got our boot order for priorities for booting up. So we've got our hard drive, and you can choose your boot settings. So if you want to boot from a CD or DVD-ROM drive, you can choose that as your primary boot. USB hard drives, all those kinds of things. Again, I would leave it set to Windows Boot Manager or your main M.2 drive or SSD. Next up, we've got our Uefi hard drive BBS priorities. So again, same sort of deal. If you've got more than one drive which is connected on M.2 or SATA, you may find there's options for more drives, so you can select the correct one. If, for instance, you've got an older drive that you've put into the system and you've got a newer M.2 drive, both drives have got Windows on, rather than leaving it set so it just picks up the first boot manager, you can actually specifically tell it to use a different device. So that can be quite handy if you're adding older hard drives into the system which may still have Windows on them. Next up is going to be security. Again, this is all the sort of things that you'd use for Uefi devices. TPM, Trusted Computing, you can have that enabled. If you've got Windows 11, you may have to do that. At the moment, we're pretty lucky we can get away without doing that in most cases. You can do, and this is where you can erase your TPM settings and keys, all that kind of stuff. Next one is the chassis intrusion configuration. There is a header on the motherboard called, I think it's JCI1, which is the chassis intrusion pin, so you can have it so that it's set to enabled or disabled. Next is secure boot. Again, you may need to do this for certain devices and certain Windows. You can choose for disabled, and you can have secure boot mode, you can have standard. This will install the factory default settings for all the keys. Factory defaults it's just a bit of a mess, really. Secure boot, all part of the TPM setup for the trusted platform. Really, with this kind of stuff, it's best leaving it disabled so you don't have to memorize keys or you don't have to save keys. If you change anything at a later date, then it is going to be a nightmare. If you do enable this, I would leave it disabled. So that is it in settings and security. Next, we've got save and exit. Obviously, once you've made your settings and changes, you can save and exit. So So that is it for this main section. So let's head down now into OC. So this is our overclocking. Now obviously this is the B460M, so there's not really a great deal we can do. There are some things which I would definitely suggest doing though. So we've got our OC Explore mode. You can set to normal or you can set to expert. It doesn't make a great deal of difference. It's mostly for memory timings. You've got your CPU ratio. You can't change that there a great deal. You can set it to all core. I would say is your best option for performance wise. CPU ratio, you can type in a specific figure if you want to for underclocking, but you can't go over the system's rated speeds. So don't think you can just type in a setting in there of maybe 4500 megahertz and it will stick. It won't. It will ignore it and it will just revert after. Advanced CPU configurations. So we've got things like your hyperthreading. You can enable or disable active processor cores. You could, if you want to, you could reduce the cores so only 3 or 2 or 1 are working, again depending on the processor you're using. Leave that set to all. You've got Intel Adaptive Thermal Monitor, so this basically stops the processor from overheating. If you disable that, you may get a little bit more performance out of it. Just make sure you've got some very good cooling. Intel C states, so this is your kind of sleep states or power management states. You can have those enabled, disabled or auto. I'd leave those set to auto unless you have a specific reason not to. And C1E support, so this is your low power or halt states. You can have that enabled or disabled. Again, choice is entirely up to you. I'd probably leave it disabled just so you get a bit more power out of the system. Package C state limit, so you've got options in there for various types of settings, so from C0 to C10. Again, unless you know specifically what you're doing or you have a specific reason to, just leave this set to auto. This is your Intel speed step technology, so this you can enable or disable. I would leave that enabled. Intel Turbo Boost, again, if you want to get the most out of your processor, leave that enabled. Your long duration power limits, you can set those there if you want to. For turbo boosting, again, unless you're either just playing or testing or trying to get some better benchmark scores, probably best leaving all of these bits set to auto unless you have a specific reason to. So the same goes for the long duration, short duration, CPU current limit. Again, you can change that a little bit if you want to. I would suggest leaving it as it is unless you have a reason not to. Really the only one you probably want to change on here, the CPU PCI spread spectrum. If you're getting crashes, you might want to enable that just to give the system a little bit more stability. Realistically, these days it's pretty decent, it works well, so I would set it to auto. Next one is your ring ratio. Again, leave that set to auto. CPU cooler tuning, and this is the important one. If you want to get the most out of your processor, especially on this platform, set this to water cooler. If you're just using the boxed cooler, it will restrict the PL1 limits to 65 watts. If you're using a tower cooler, like say the Vitro V5 or the Tough Air 310, that kind of thing, Arctic freezers, those sorts of things, either set it to water cooler or set it to air tower cooler. Both will give you the same results. So I'm actually using a air cooler in here, a decent one, so I'm going to leave this set to tower air cooler. Ideally, try and avoid using boxed coolers if you can to get a little bit more performance out of the system. Moving down, we've got our DRAM settings. So this is our memory profile, our XMP. So at the moment it is enabled. You can choose enabled or disabled, and you can manually set your DRAM frequency. So you can see there that our DDR4 3000 is our memory XMP profile, but I'm actually manually setting DRAM frequency to 2666, which for this processor is the maximum you can do. If you're having problems with your RAM, you can always downclock the RAM a little bit. So if you're having issues, you maybe got a slightly faulty stick of RAM, you could maybe lower this to 2400, see if the system becomes more stable. But ideally, depending on the processor, you want this set to either 2666 or 2933 if you're using i7 or i9. Memory try it, so you can choose different CAS latencies. So if you want to maybe reduce the CAS latency a little bit more, trying to overclock the RAM slightly more, get you a little bit more performance possibly, you can try lower CAS latencies. So there, our stick is officially a CL15 stick, but we could try CL14 just to try and get a little bit more performance. But again, ideally I would set that to disabled unless you have a specific reason for actually changing it. DRAM timing mode, so you've got auto, link or unlink, so I would set that to auto, and that way the system will look at your RAM, look at your processor and see what the most efficient link timings are going to be. Memory Fastboot, so this enables or disables memory training. I would leave this enabled, let it train the RAM whenever it feels it needs to. You can set that to disabled no training or slow training, etc. Slow training will probably give you the best options if you're having issues with your XMP settings not being fully supported in MSI's BIOS for the particular revision you're on. This will just take a little bit longer to train the RAM, but might actually dial in slightly better settings for you. Again, we are restricted on this board to memory timings in regard to XMP profiles, so probably also is going to be your best bet. Next we've got digital power, so we've got our CPU load line calibration. You can set various modes. This is more for overclocking depending on what processor you're using. Again, I would set this to auto. You can have a play around with that. You might find that mode 1 actually works better for you. If that doesn't, just go through and try the settings, run a Cinebench run, see if it improves. Realistically, probably auto is going to be your best setting there. So moving down, we've got more voltage settings, CPU core voltage, offset mode. We've got the offsets, all those kinds of things. You can change those manually should you wish to. Again, probably less leaving those well alone unless you have a reason to. CPU memory change detect. So this is if you are actually swapping out RAM and you want the system to actually recognize the fact that there is RAM been moved or changed, so it actually trains again. You can leave that to enable or disabled. I would leave it enabled just in case you do swap out any RAM. That way the system's going to try and automatically reconfigure the system for the new RAM. Next up, CPU specifications. So again, this is giving you more details about your CPU and what it supports. Just information really in there. Memory Z does exactly the same thing, just reads the SPD of the RAM chips. CPU features, you can choose to enable or disable. So you've got your limit CPU ID maximum. You've also got your Intel virtualization, so I'm actually going to disable that because we're not using any virtualization technology. Hardware prefetcher, you can enable or disable. Essentially, all these things you probably want to leave exactly as they are. The only thing I would say, if you're not using virtualization, you might as well disable it for security purposes. And that is it for the OC mode. So next one is going to be M-Flash. So this is for flashing your BIOS. If you want to go in and flash a BIOS, then it will automatically reboot and enter flash mode. It offers you the option, do you want to enter flash mode? We don't currently. So next one, we've got OC profile. So in a moment, if you've set a profile with a little bit of overclocking or some changes to it, it's a bit misleading. It's not technically overclocking because you're just making some changes to the BIOS, but you can save BIOS profiles, save them to ROM, save them to USB, or you can actually load them from a USB as well. So if maybe you've dialed in some settings which work particularly well, you could save them to a USB stick. If you then swapped out your motherboard because it had a fault with it, you could reload your settings from that USB stick as a good starting place with your new motherboard. Next up is going to be hardware monitor. This again is probably going to be the one you're going to want to use. So this is where we do our fan control and also where we monitor our temperatures from. Also gives you a readout of your system temperatures and voltages, etc. So if there's anything weird going on with your system, you can check out your voltages, make sure they all look okay. Same goes for the temperatures. So at the moment we're looking pretty good. CPU's at 31, systems at 34, the MOSFETs was 36, PCH or your chipsets at 47, and the CPU socket itself is at 28 degrees, so those are all absolutely fine. In this top section, so this is where we're monitoring. So when you're selecting a specific fan header, so let's start with CPU 1. So we obviously, for the CPU fan, you want to be monitoring your CPU core temperature or your socket temperature, whichever. Probably your core temperature is going to be the more valid one. You can choose here PWM, so if you're using a 4-pin PWM fan, choose PWM. If you're using some kind of strange cooler with a 3-pin, or you've just got a 3-pin fan, choose DC and you can choose voltage DC. Your temperature source there, you can choose whether it's going to be the core, system, MOS, CPU socket, etc. And also your step up time and step down time. Now depending on your fans, if you want them to ramp up quick and ramp back down slowly, then you can set it so the fans take longer. You can just scroll through there. So 1 second is the slowdown time, and we're going to speed up in 0.1 of a second. So it's going to ramp down slower but ramp up quick. Hopefully that makes sense. Smart fan mode you can enable or disable. If you disable smart fan mode, you don't get a great deal of control over what is going on. If you enable smart fan mode, then you can move these around and choose how you want to. Now generally I set my fan curve as being 40% fan, again depending on the fan. As we go through, I normally set it to 60% at 60. So you can dial that around. So 60% on the bottom is the fan speed and the temperature is on the left hand side, so 60 at 60, and then I have full speed at anything over 70 degrees, or when it gets 70 degrees. So gradual curve going up there for our CPU fan. Now if we go over to perhaps a pump fan, now we haven't got a pump fan connected, but the same sort of deal. So on this you could choose a different thing. So your temperature source, you could maybe, if you wanted to, choose your system or CPU socket, something like that. It's probably more relevant if we actually look at a system fan. So if we look at a system fan, so you could then, if you want to, depending where the system fan is, your temperature source you could choose now as being your system, so your main system temperature, which is down here, which may be different from your CPU core temperature. Again, realistically, I would say most of the time you're best off just leaving it set to CPU core, unless you have a specific reason otherwise. Again, you can choose PWM or DC for all of the fan headers, so that's the CPU, pump, system 1 and system 2. Very easy to do. You can, if you want to, of course, you can set all full speed, which is a little bit insane, but you might want to. Set all default, so if you make some settings which are really wrong, set it back to default, and you can do all set cancel. So that's pretty much it in this section. If you go into about, it just tells you what it's all about there, copyright warning, and you've got help, so it tells you what keys you can use to actually move around in this environment. Once you're done, you just click on the X there, and that will take you back to the main window. And the last one is Board Explorer. So if you're not too sure what is what, then you can click on certain parts of the board, and it'll tell you what it is and give you a layout. So this is showing you what is actually enabled at the moment. So our audio is enabled, our Wi-Fi, our LAN, and all those kinds of things. CPU socket tells you what CPU is in there. Our M.2 drive is connected, so it tells you there. Super I/O is enabled, all those kinds of things. So it basically gives you a layout of what the board is and what it does. So that is pretty much it. Once you're done, you can just click on the X at the top here, and it'll tell you what settings you've changed. And obviously, if you want to do it, if for some reason you've changed something here and you're not happy with it, then of course you can just click on no, go back in, change it, and put it back to how you think it should be. But once you're happy and it's all done, just click on yes, and it will save the settings and reboot the system. So that is it for a tour of the MSI B460M Pro VDH Wi-Fi. If you've got any comments or questions or anything you feel wasn't covered and you want more information, please do reach out. Like I said, mike@mikesunboxing.com, or you can use our Discord. Links for that will be in the video description below, or just leave something in the comments and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So that's it for this one. Hopefully it's been useful. If it has, click on the thumbs up button, and if you want to see more content, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. But for now, I've been Mike. This is Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and hopefully we'll catch you in the very next video. Thanks for watching.